Can you remember the most terrifying video game that you've ever played? Was it a jump scare filled action game? A disturbing point and click? A gruesome third-person shooter? For years, horror games have had a tendency to leave long-standing effects on our minds and bodies, giving off an almost cathartic nostalgia that no other games can replicate. But what is it that makes these games so memorable? Today I'm joined by my friend SlasherThrasher in hopes to discover more of why games scare us. Caution: this video contains clips that may be considered sensitive to some. Viewer discretion is advised.
Well, I believe that horror, in general, is putting people in vulnerable places. When you transcend a theater or movie experience into gaming, you have control of a character, whether that character feels like yourself or you controlling a character in a narrative. That now puts a little bit more focus on the outcome. You know, regardless of if there's an ending to the game or not, there's danger, whether you perceive it to be real or not. The game is crafted to do so. And thus, I think that's why we really get ultimately scared.
There isn't one magic formula for a terrifying video game. There are a multitude of strategies that game developers utilize to keep us on edge, hesitant to move around each corner, afraid of what might jump out at us. Music, lighting, and writing can all add to the overall atmosphere of a game and even cause some otherwise unassuming games to scare the living heck out of us. Let's take a look at a few popular ways games have scared us in the past. One of the most classic examples of a strategy to scare comes from that of a classic jump scare game. There are certainly cheap versions of these, like that maze game with a randomly spliced horrifying witch face at the end. You guys know which one I'm talking about. These are the games that made PewDiePie and Markiplier YouTube famous. However, there is a huge difference between a jump scare sprinkled into a game and just pure exploitation of my senses. Yes, Amnesia, I'm looking at you. There you are, traversing down a lengthy, dimly lit corridor. Your palms are sweating, music is echoing in your brain, high-pitched piano sound effects falsely trigger your fight or flight reflex, only to sigh briefly, turn around, and BAM! A raging serial killer swings an axe at your head and you scream at the top of your lungs like a baby. These are the Dead Spaces, the Resident Evils, and some of the other classic games that cause survival horrors to shine. Honestly, in some ways, I've been just as triggered in these ways by roguelike dungeon crawlers like Bloodborne or Dark Souls. There is just something about being vulnerable that really creates a tension tough enough to slice into with a knife. I couldn't talk about jump scares without mentioning Five Nights at Freddy's. The franchise has created a legacy for itself that will forever live atop the horror realm of gaming. It's equal parts spooky and cerebral, but some of the most well-crafted scenes are done by way of jump scare, and man, they are really good.
The thing that scared me the most, and the first huge scare I ever had, was Resident Evil 2. That game has an A and B scenario, and what had happened is I had gone through the game once, and I was in B scenario, and I expected these hands to climb through and sort of grab at me like they did in scenario A, and this did not happen. So ultimately, when I went through scenario B and that didn't happen, I was like, okay, whatever. Well, going back through that same hallway, a whole body flew through the window, and I about jumped out of my skin, threw my controller up in the air, and ran screaming to my mother.
Along the same lines of other survival horror games, atmospheric horror is one of the most engrossing I've ever come across in modern media, and possibly the best. I still remember the first time I was ever scared playing a video game. I was 7 or 8 years old, playing Alien 3 on the Super Nintendo. Although this is listed as an action shooter game, there is something about the way it was presented that just creeped me out. The booming percussion mixed with poor lighting and genuine feeling of just being alone absolutely haunted me. To add to it, the game was frustratingly difficult, as you had to dodge facehuggers and other aliens while traversing through empty corridors to ultimately fend off the queen. Honestly, it can be hard to convey fear in a game that's only 16 bits, but they did a pretty damn good job here due to the sheer hopeless atmosphere it creates. Other than that, it's a pretty terrible game. But this speaks volumes to how various details can add up to one of the most terrifying gaming experiences you'll ever have. When it comes to atmospheric horror, perhaps no other gaming franchise does it better than Silent Hill. Much of the early Silent Hill games are spent alone, wandering through a vast, cold, and dead environment with little to no music and enemies that will haunt your dreams. I avoided many of the Silent Hill games for a long time because of how they made me feel. Just terribly uncomfortable. I mean, heck, I'm a guy that gets up and leaves the room during scenes of awkwardness and conflict in non-horror movies. When the stakes are changed and your life is potentially on the line, count me out. Atmosphere and attention to detail is how Stephen King became the horror genius he is today. Do you think It would have been nearly as popular or revered among horror fans if the description was simply a clown with sharp teeth? Not a chance. But when that description goes further into the details, where there are pages upon pages building suspense for the description of this inhuman, petrifying version of a clown, now you have some real horror. Atmosphere and writing is also how some games have portrayed themselves as scary without amassing a huge depth of jump scares or super detailed graphics. When I think of a game like Condemned, for example, critically it's a complete dud. It was a game overlooked by pretty much everybody that played it. But when true horror fans were immersed into its atmosphere, it became so much more than initially perceived. It became horror. Atmosphere is so powerful, in fact, it can cause a game to be absolutely terrifying without actually saying anything. Take the game Limbo, or Inside, for example. If you have arachnophobia, I highly suggest looking somewhere else for a horror game because Playdead's masterpiece crafts the build-up to meeting your eight-legged friend so incredibly well it's worth playing just for the engrossing atmosphere itself.
Atmosphere and sound design are key elements. I can play a horror game, and especially one without headphones on, and it might not even scare me, but if you have the right sounds, the right sound design, the right music effects, it can truly scare you, and it can truly put you in that sense of, oh my gosh, what is around the corner? And then add that with an effective atmosphere of dread-inducing horror, that can almost just totally overrule any bad writing or maybe even cheap jump scares. It really comes together though, and I swear if you don't play horror games with headphones on, it almost feels like you're missing out on half the experience because it is absolutely frightening sometimes.
Where to start with how gore can be scary? Well, first of all, video games are no strangers to controversy involving blood and guts. I think back to when I was a kid in the 90s and the amount of outraged parents with a little-known fighting game called Mortal Kombat. Sure, Jimmy, you like fighting games? How about a game where you rip out somebody's spinal cord to a course of blood? Yeah, let's just say this and Doom were some of the major violators of no-gore limitations of video games. Like imagine if Mario was realistic when it came to dispelling enemies. Ugh. But nowadays, gore seems to be omnipresent in pretty much every video game with a teen or above rating. But what causes it to be scary? Surely a bloody game like Hotline Miami or Grand Theft Auto isn't necessarily scary. We must take it a step further and focus on how the gore is portrayed. Being grossed out alone on body parts being ripped out isn't exactly scary, but the thought of it is. Take the infamous Dead Space 2 scene where you literally stick a needle in your eye. The fact that you could make the tiniest mistake and have it result in the machine brutally destroying your eyeball was terrifying beyond belief. Enough so that I had to take a break from the game because, I'm a scaredy cat. Like, holy heck, definitely one of the scariest things I've ever experienced in a video game, and is honestly the sole reason I haven't pulled the trigger on laser eye surgery. Another example of this is when you become a Strogg in Quake 4. You're strapped in, watching a guy in front of you literally get his legs sawed off as you watch your character's body squirm around, adept to what is about to become of him. Whoever directed these scenes certainly know what to do to make us feel uncomfortable. Over time, gore in video games has desensitized me for the most part, but there are still examples like those previously mentioned that can really haunt me to the soul. Other great examples of scary games with great gore include Phantasmagoria and Harvester for the PC. Both games may be quite dated, but that does little to detract from the graphic scenes of dismemberment and bloodiness that end up giving these games a timeless scariness. Psychological horror is perhaps one of the hardest types of horror to emulate, but can definitely leave some of the biggest impacts. Much like the suspense thriller of Silence of the Lambs, there are always ways to portray a character or write lines of dialogue that will black out the soul. Not only that, but introducing elements like the sanity meter and amnesia, where the seemingly real glitches from Eternal Darkness cause the gamer to feel the psychological effects of the character that they're playing at the game. Better yet is when a game throws in a mind-bending twist that absolutely blows the lid off the possibilities of horror you could have seen thus far in a game. Doki Doki Literature Club is a perfect example of taking a seemingly innocent game and transforming it into a sadistic representation of the antithesis of a schoolgirl game. Granted, many YouTubers and streamers spoiled the twists and turns this game has presented over the years, but imagine being someone who bought this game initially, having no idea what would unfold throughout its story and how terrifying the end result would be. One of my favorite examples of a psychological horror comes from 2015's Soma, a game taking the route of a more sci-fi game than outright horror, but man, did it scare the absolute f*** out of me the first time I played it. Oddly enough, it reminded me a bit of one of my favorite suspense thriller movies of all time, Event Horizon. A relatively unknown game that follows along the lines of psychological horror comes from 1995 on the PC. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. This point-and-click game, adapted from Harlan Ellison's short story with the same title, follows a supercomputer who is torturing the 5 remaining members of the human race through some of the most harrowing experiments imaginable. There's just a hopelessness about it that is unrivaled in the medium, and I highly suggest picking it up if you have the chance. Have you ever played a game that scared you but wasn't actually a horror game? Whether it's the absolute sense of emptiness in Minecraft, or the time pressure or lore exuded by Majora's Mask, there are plenty of seemingly normal games that scare the heck out of us, and many are done on complete accident. The biggest example personally I can think of is an experience I had from a game on the Amiga called Top Banana. Yeah, I don't quite understand the title there either. To me, the game seemed like a pretty straightforward platformer, although it a bit weird, but the more I played it, it just creeped me the heck out. Not to mention the fact that the game literally can cause blindness, although I don't think there are any reported cases of that actually happening. The mess of enemies, platforms, and backgrounds are so trippy that I had nightmares about it as a kid, and it got so bad that I thought the game was possessed and proceeded to throw it out. I mean, just look at it. It's freaking creepy. Sticking with the Amiga is another straight-up creepy game, Weird Dreams. Wow, I can't imagine that would be creepy. This game is a short point-and-click with a real heart rate monitor, and I'll be honest, I have no idea what is even happening in this game. The last major example I can think of from my childhood was Myst. There was something about the empty world you explored that just terrified me to no end. I know the game wasn't supposed to be scary, but the thought of being lost with no real direction from the game gave me the creeps. Anyone else have this issue? Other honorable mentions for creepy games include Killer 7, Cho Aniki, and LSD Dream Emulator. So, with all the ways games can cause us to be scared, how do you know which one is the scariest you've ever played? To me, the scariest game I've ever played is undoubtedly Outlast. There's a reason I haven't talked about it yet. To me, this game is the epitome of terror. Its unique blend of realism, jump scares, atmosphere, psychological scares, and gore. Most of all, the first time I played it, it had just launched on the PS4 store, so I knew nothing about how scary it was, and man, was I in for a treat. Let's just say I didn't sleep for a week. Well guys, that's gonna do it for this episode of the Mega Man Cave. What games are your favorites of all time in the horror genre? What things about video games scare you the most? Are there any games that weren't supposed to be scary that ended up scaring you? Please leave them in the comments below. If you like this video and you want to see more like it, please consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and smashing the bell for notifications so that my videos can jump to the top of your list. I want to thank SlasherThrasher again for joining me on this episode, and I will catch you guys next time.